Hi, welcome to Art Accelerated's seventh reading for our new series of 2021. And we have Deborah Lincoln here today to read from her new book, and Lana Hechtman Ayers, who's going to talk and interview Deborah. So we're very lucky to have both of you, and take it away, Lana.
I'm delighted to be here with you both. I want to tell you a little bit about Deborah Lincoln. Deborah Lincoln has lived on the Oregon coast for 11 years. She grew up in the small town of Salina, Ohio, and earned a bachelor's degree in English from Michigan State University and a master's degree in library science from the University of Michigan. She and her husband have 3 grown sons. Of her passion for historical fiction, she says, "I'm fascinated by the way events, wars and cataclysms and upheavals, of course, but the everyday changes that wash over everyday lives bring a poignancy to a person's efforts to survive and prosper. I hate the idea that the brave, intelligent people have been forgotten, that the hardships they underwent have melted away like a rim of ice on a warm spring day." We're here today to talk about Deborah's most recent novel. It's a historical fiction called An Irish Wife. Deborah, can you start out by telling us your inspiration for the story of An Irish Wife?
Irish Wife is a sequel to my first book, which was Agnes Cannon's War, which took place during the Civil War. And I wanted to follow the characters. It's a sequel, but it's a standalone too. You don't have to have read the first one. But I wanted to follow the characters into the next, what most interesting period of American history, and that's the Gilded Age, the 1880s. The protagonist, Harry, is based on my great-grandfather, who grew up in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, which is in the middle of the richest coal fields in the world at the time. And the 1880s were a time of industrial expansion and promise for America. And I wanted to get into my great-grandfather's life and what he must have been going through and what kinds of experiences he might have had in the America of that time, which is not only full of promise and massive fortunes, but also full of a lot of the issues we deal with today, like environmental degradation and rich versus poor and immigration and sleazy politics. So that's what I got me started on this particular book and took me through this particular story.
Thanks, Deborah. How wonderful that it's based on your own ancestry.
Yeah. They did a lot of interesting things. Good stories back then.
Would you like to read a little bit of the story to us?
Sure. I'll start out at the beginning. February 1930. Harry's wife brings him coffee and ginger snaps before she leaves for her bridge game, wrapped up in the raccoon coat he'd bought her 5 years ago. It's beginning to look ratty, and there won't be another one. She doesn't want to leave him alone, the part-time nurse who pestered him most days taking a holiday, but he insists. Bridge is important to her. She is fiercely competitive and manages to win $2 or $3 every week. Her one little vice, she says. Maybe that's how we'll pay the cook. She tucks the Afghan around his thin legs and puts another log on the fire. She's left him the newspaper and another of the boxes, this one with some of his personal papers. Wouldn't do to leave them behind when he goes, rubbish from a life well lived. He'd rather be at the office, but instead he's swaddled in dressing gown and slippers at midday, watching the snow float past the veranda. He's glad he didn't have to dig out the Plymouth this morning, hasn't driven it for a month and doesn't want to as long as the weather's foul. He shakes his head. His driving days are over and he knows it. The snow must be 2 feet deep along the roadside and it's coming down now in great white flakes. The radio says there'll be another 6 inches before it stops. His wife bought him one of those Zenith consoles for Christmas this year, though he wishes she hadn't. They can't afford such luxuries now. There'll be no new car this year, and if the bank collapses, they'll be hard put heating this cavern of a house, with much less buying new cars and radios. The box is full of old letters and certificates of election, most of which he lost. News clippings. Harry picks up the one where the boys were off to the Mexican border. No one remembers that now, that men fought and died in Mexico, caught up in that mess, chasing Pancho Villa all over hell and back. But back then, 1916, all the boys in Uniontown were hot for the Army. They all trooped up to Connellsville and hopped on a train, and off they went. 5,000 mothers and fathers and sweethearts, waving and cheering and sobbing. Harry tries to remember how he felt, sending his 4 oldest boys off to get shot at. He thinks he was proud, no reason not to be. He remembers how his wife beamed. Young Dan was there too, desperate to go with his brothers, but a couple years shy of 18. He remembers his wife clinging to Dan's hand throughout, Dan trying to shake her off. That was in May. By October, they were all back again, fit and sunburned. 2 years later, they shipped out for France. This time, the Army took all 5 of them, John, Charlie, Harold, Bill, Dan. The 2 little boys left at home to fashion make-believe rifles out of firewood and talk about when it's their turn. And young Agnes, no one paid any attention to her at all. He rustles through the stack of papers for the folder that lies buried at the bottom of the box, one he tucked away years ago. He pulls it out and opens it across his lap. It cracks along the spine. There are 2 news clippings, a parent letter and a photograph. The headline in the Connellsville paper trumpets, "The Moloch of the Mine, 14 victims of fire damp." The Somerset paper simply reports, "Mine disaster, 14 men killed." It was what now, 45, 50 years ago? 1884, the clippings say, nearly 46. He tucks them back into the folder and picks up the photograph. It shows a young woman, no more than 25, dressed in a fashion popular just before the Great War. High-necked, long-sleeved lace blouse, high-waisted skirt, big eyes like a silent film star. Her wavy hair is parted in the middle and cascades down her back, and it is dark, black like her mother's. He takes up the letter and reads it through. The words, oddly enough, raise only one sensation, a scent, the acrid scent of coal burning in ovens, slowly turning into coke, the smell of the 80s and progress and death and dirt. He folds the letter carefully. The creases are still good. It has lain untouched in the folder for the past 20 years. He slides letter and photographs behind the clippings, closes the folder, drops it to the floor, and reaches for today's Post-Gazette. The paper says business is on the upward trend, a complete readjustment expected in a few months. Harry stares out at the snow. Maybe we won't lose the cook after all. Chapter 1, 1870s. Harry was 4 years old when his mother brought him home to the valley between the rivers where her family had lived for 100 years, where the Youghiogheny River wiggled north through folded hills and smoky valleys, crashed into the Monongahela on its way, and joined the Allegheny. Together, their waters became the great Ohio River, the highway into that dim west of gold mines and vast distances and vaguely recalled adventures. South of the Yough Valley, at the point where Connellsville took root around Stewart's Crossing, swept a land of ridges and knolls, rolling farmland, and steep forested gorges. Back then, new snow crunched underfoot, and breath stung harsh and lovely in his child's throat. A place where cardinals, brilliant drops of red like blood, sang through winter and into spring, where rills freshened with ice melt, and the shadows of mudcats lingered near their rounded rocky nests. Harry's young world revolved around the Laurel Highlands and Chestnut Ridge to the east, clothed in the cool greens of summer and the blue-white of winter. He loved the way dawn took its time climbing over the summit of the ridge in autumn. The air changed to a pink and green haze then, and softened just as the maples and birches, beeches and red oaks turned. He'd always loved that ridge, fancying, as a small child does without regard for direction or authenticity, that the reward for peeking over its crest would be the sight of paradise. The broad world existed in mystery beyond Uniontown, on the other side of those Pennsylvania hills, maybe even to the wild world of Montana, his father and his earliest memories. When his twice great-grandfather built the old farmstead, the lowlands, as well as the ridges, were clothed with silent, deep woods of beech and sugar maples, with hickory and walnuts and oak for the nuts that fed men and beasts, with birch and elms simply for beauty. Much of the northern areas of the country were thick with chestnuts and rich with understories of ferns and fungus, with songbirds and salamanders, land snails and beetles. The land that had settled into steep-sided, deeply forested ridges and troughs was born out of the violence of continents smashing against one another like the slow motion movement of a nightmare lasting eons. In the process, ancient ferns and scaly bark trees were mashed into peat, squeezed until nothing was left but the precious carbon, the rich black stone heart of the hills, buried beneath the fields and pastures. By the time Harry came of age, the chestnuts were doomed to blight, the creeks were sluggish with filth, and the stone heart had turned cancerous. We can stop there for a minute.
Thank you, Deborah. Such rich, vivid prose. I feel like I've been there myself.
It's a beautiful place.
Can you tell us, how did you go about doing your research for An Irish Wife?
Well, one thing I did, which I'm really glad I did, was travel to southwestern Pennsylvania, to Uniontown, saw my great-grandfather's house, to get the feel for the land and the area and the hills. And I think it's really important to have a sense of place, to get the smells and the sense of the place. But mostly I just bury myself in the internet. You can find anything on the internet. My first book, I figured out how to amputate a leg without anesthetic, just by reading the internet. I don't think I'd try it. But I used a lot of newspapers, old newspapers from the Times, articles on mine disasters particularly, and reports from the state regulators of mining on how mines were run, and old maps. Old maps are just wonderful to peruse. You can learn so much. I found one map with the names of the landowners on it, and found my relatives' farms, the actual location of their farms and their homes. And I could go on doing this research forever, so I'll stop. But that's one reason why I like historic fiction, because you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes on the internet and find out all sorts of marvelous things.
Wow. It sounds like a lot of wonderful fun in doing the research. Yeah.
It is. You don't get a lot of writing done, but you sure get a lot of fun exploring done.
And how lucky to find some of your actual relatives within the research.
Yeah, yeah.
So what was the most difficult part of telling this story, and what was the most fun for you?
Most difficult, this and any of my writing, is getting into the characters' heads and making them seem real. I need a lot more practice on that. I like to do it, and I like to try to think the way they're thinking and feel what they're feeling. But it's very, very difficult for me. It's quite a slog. The most fun is describing the place, making the place, the locale, a character in the novel, and making a sense of place, I think, is so important, particularly in historical fiction. And that I really enjoy doing. I like learning about the vegetation and the animals and the birds and the geology of an area, and then turning it into prose that can describe it and make people feel like they're there.
Well, it's truly obvious that place is a character in your story. I mean, your descriptions are so rich. But I
Thank you.
think as well, I loved Harry's character particularly, and I loved being inside Harry's head. And I really felt like this is an authentic boy growing up and learning about his life and his thoughts and feelings. It was really, really wonderful for me. I enjoyed it so much.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm glad it came across that way. Huh. You're never really satisfied with your own writing, I'm sure.
Oh, that's true. I know that for myself.
Yeah.
Would you mind reading a little bit more from the story for us?
Sure. I'm jumping ahead a little bit because I want to introduce the other main character, who is a woman that Harry meets in the course of this story, an immigrant who is married to a coal miner and has recently come from Ireland. So we're at October 1883. My name is Niamh Kilgareth. She pushed her hair behind her ears, filthy from 8 days in steerage and a week on the road before that. With barely enough water to clean her face and hands, there hadn't been enough to wash it. Spell it. The man behind the desk didn't look up. He dipped his pen and held it poised. Niamh Kil. He looked up. Nia? Yes, MH. What kind of name is that? Irish. It's pronounced Niamh. Neve. He looked down. Better Americanize this, girl. No one here wants to twist a tongue around that. Place of birth? I will then. Neve, a new country, a new name, already a piece of herself lost. No, she would never change it. Ireland, County Galway. Age, 21 years. Who paid your passage? My intended. Niamh glanced around the cavernous interior as if Martin might appear out of the hoard, but of course he did not. Thank the Virgin. Better to put that meeting off as long as may be. Your fiancé, he looked her over. He might have been judging whether she was comely enough for a sweetheart, or he might be puzzling out if she told the truth. Aye, she ducked her head, hoping she looked submissive instead of angry, which is what she was. It was nothing to do with him, what she planned once she entered this country, so long as it was not villainy. Padraig slipped his hand in hers and squeezed. He ever knew her moods and was quick to settle her when her temper flashed, which was often. The man at the table lost interest in her and waved to Padraig. Next. Patrick Kilgareth, the boy said. Patrick, 15 years, County Galway. Ah, Patrick then, no more her dear Padraig. The man looked up and squinted. Smart one, eh? No, sir, I'm only after helping you with the line here. He waved to the crowd behind him, the bulk of the passengers from the city of Richmond who had shared their distinctly cramped quarters from Queenstown. The fellow nodded at Niamh. Relationship? I'd be her brother, sir, and Mr. Gill, that is her intended. He paid my way as well. And what do you propose doing here in this great country? The man appeared to be enjoying himself now. Coal mining, sir, Patrick said, along beside Mr. Gill. He's fixed it already. The man jotted something more, leaned back and inspected his work, made another mark and twiddled his pen between fat fingers while I looked up. He smiled. Patrick could charm the rainbow off a leprechaun. See you do your job then, son. Work hard and make your sister here, he nodded at Niamh, proud, and you'll be welcome in my country. That way, he pointed, peered around them. Next, he hollered. They'd been dismissed, but not yet finished. A disorderly line had formed, bordered by officials in sack coats and wingtip collars, who swirled their hands in a desultory effort to move the line along through a maze of barriers toward an open area ahead. Niamh was minded of her father and brothers at shearing time, guiding the Roscommons into the pens. She let go her breath, hadn't realized she'd been holding it. Not that she particularly wanted to inhale the malodorous crowd that filled the great becolumned interior of Castle Garden, reeked even more than the steerage compartments below decks. With the Inquisition finished, she was free to look around her at the vivid collection of humanity that filled the rotunda. She thought she identified Slavs and Germans, their women in colorful kerchiefs and short skirts that gave a scandalous view of top boots almost to the knee. Russians sported woolen gray overcoats in spite of the stifling autumn heat that lingered late into the evening. She recognized Italian and Norwegian, languages she'd listened to day and night on the boat, and caught the familiar cadence of Scots, the spitting and spluttering of Welsh, the scouse of Liverpool. It was a babble and a show, more people than she'd seen in one place in all her life. The great round building loomed large as Binduv. It was dark when she'd first seen it, coming on 8 in the evening when the ferry pulled in close to shore, and it was her first sight of America. Lit up it was, brilliant lights like the sun spearing the shadows, and the streets as well, lined with poles that held glowing globes, turning the night into day. She'd never seen anything like it, not even in Cork or Queenstown. If America could transform the dark, sure it could turn Patrick from a sheep-shearing farm boy into a gentleman of means. She touched her fingers to a rosary hidden beneath the bodice of her dress. It had been her grandmother's, made of fine green polished beads with a small heavy silver cross, badly tarnished. Her grandmother felt even farther away now. Niev had often felt Granny's presence in the fields around Killiney long after she'd passed on, and in the churchyard where she lay next to the grandfather who died during the lean years. Granny had watched out for all of them from the land of the Sidhe, but Granny had not yet found her in this new country. It would indeed be a long wait this night. The outer gates would not be opened until all the passengers had passed through the lines and been sorted. The fortunate ones to be loosed on the city, and the unfortunate ones, those with no means of support in this new country, to be penned into a large cage at one side. Niev dropped her valise to the floor and sat on it. She'd hoped for a space along the wall to lean against, but they were all taken. So many women with babes in arms, but also strapping men with beards and dark looks, propped with hands and pockets. Patrick carried 2 valises, one for his clothing and one for the bedding and utensils they'd required on ship. And he set them next to her with a word about keeping them safe from thieves. I've seen nothing of that sort yet, Niev said, though Mrs. Bagnall told me you'd never see the deed done until too late. She watched as the family of a woman traveling without a husband, but with 8 children, was herded into the pen. She'd wondered during the trip whether they'd be allowed in. The gossip was the woman had no means of support over here. Likely she and her brood would be sent right back on the return voyage. Mrs. Bagnall's family settled with a great deal of fuss and squabbling in the space next to her, pushing a group of Slavs to the side. They planned to move in with relatives in a neighborhood called the Bronx, not far from Castle Garden. Niev wished she were going with them, to be at the end of the journey with only a short walk ahead. 15 miles, not hundreds. She hated to say goodbye to them. She'd grown fond of the 3 daughters through the long hours on the ship. They were bright and curious, cheerful. It would be a relief not to have their mother's voice going without stop day after day, but it was the sound of home, and she found she would miss it. The night hours crawled and the noise did not abate. Patrick slept through it, curled on the floor with his head on a valise, but Niev fretted about the next step. She went over Martin's instructions in her head. No need to read them again. She'd read them 1,000 times. Walk along the water on the west 7 blocks to the railroad station. Take the ferry to Jersey City, then the morning train toward Pittsburgh. If they missed the following morning's train, they'd have to stay the day in the station. Her stomach fluttered. It was all so new. She closed her eyes, shut out the crowd, the smells, the sounds, retreated. Benli Halunshinu. Da would sing to her, soft and slow, in the summer evenings as the late light faded. English, Patrick murmured. He sat up, hair wild, and glanced around. It must be English, now we're in America. He stood and held out his hand to haul her to her feet. The crowd was astir, the doors opening onto pre-dawn blackness. I'll not lose my Irish so soon, she said, but he paid no heed. The excitement in his face was mirrored in those around him. Mothers gathered bundles and infants. Fathers hoisted toddlers to their shoulders. A murmur like the rush of a creek swelled, anticipation crackling through the crowd. Weariness forgotten, the long voyage behind them, the mass of immigrants prepared to take their first step onto true American ground.
Thank you. I love a spunky heroine, and Eve is certainly spunky.
She is fun.
After having read Agnes Cannon's War and An Irish Wife, I am eager for more from you. Do you have any inkling of what your next writing project might be?
Well, getting back to something I started probably 10 years ago, before Irish Wife, and that's a story that takes place in Montana right after the Civil War. It's got a lot of Irish in it. I really enjoy writing about the Irish. There's a wild Irish general who's the governor of Montana and the territorial Montana. And out of my original book, Jabez, the hero, may show up because he was elected to the legislature in that territory, but probably not. But there's a Fenian invasion of Canada. There's all sorts of shenanigans that went on, actual events, a lot of real people to base the story on.
Wow.
But we'll see how that works out. Just so many good stories in history and in my own family tree that it's hard to choose which ones to tell. We'll see if that comes to be.
Well, in the meantime, can you let readers know how we can get copies of your books?
Yes, I'm hoping they'll be in the local bookstores in Manzanita and Lincoln City. They can be ordered through any local bookstore, and I encourage that. The other, bookshop.org, is an online retailer that uses local bookstores and donates part of the purchase price to local bookstores. So I encourage that as well. But other than that, any online retailer, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobe, all those will be carrying it. It's going to will be available in paperback as well as Kindle and Nook. So also my website, and that will show up here pretty soon, has the links to buy it if you get onto my website, which is deborahlincoln.org.
Thank you so much for your reading.
Thank you. Thank you both for giving me the opportunity.
Well, thank you both for coming today, and Deborah for reading, and for Lana's questions and interview. We're so lucky to have both of you here. So best of luck on your new book sales. Cross all my fingers and toes for you, Deborah. I know it's a hard slog, but yeah. Anyway, I want to thank the Oregon Cultural Trust for allowing us to even conceive of doing this by giving us the grant for doing our online programming, and to the Oregon Community Foundation for their continued support.